Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my video ranking my top 10 novels that I've read. This is top 10 novels across the board in all genres and subgenres. I've been requested this video a lot by people. A lot of people want to see it, and some of my friends who are booktubers are also working on this video idea, so I thought I may as well get around to it now. I really had to think and narrow down. I've read about 650 books in my adult life, which is, more than some people have, but way fewer than some of the authors and book reviewers that I know who are really well read in the genre, particularly ones like Brian Lee Durfee, who's read 10,000 books in his life. So this is not anywhere near as well read as others, but I decided to make a top 10 based off of the books I'd read. I'm limiting it to novels, so it's only fiction, and it's also no short story collections or novella collections in here. One of the books is a fix-up novel, so it was a short story that he kind of turned into a novel, but other than that, these are all novels. And these are my top 10 books of all time. And I got some interesting genres in here. When it comes to authors, there's only one author on here who's on here twice. That's because this author legitimately had some of the top books for me. In fact, this author has books number 1 and 3 on my list. So you'll probably, if you watch my channel, you'll probably know who it is and what those books are. Well, let's go ahead and start it. The first book I'll talk about, my number 10, is actually a book I do not have a copy of because I didn't have one for a while. I got one recently, and I actually loaned it to my grandmother to read, and that is Agatha Christie's Crooked House. Crooked House is a murder mystery novel. She wrote it right after the end of World War II. The basic premise of the book is this young man is just getting out of the military, and he wants to marry this girl that he's been corresponding with, and she wants to marry him, but she feels that she cannot marry him until one thing happens. They need to solve the mystery of her grandfather's death. And so the main character, he basically decides to become a detective and start doing the digging to figure out information about her grandfather's death. Was it natural causes or was it legitimately murder? They don't know, and so he has to go in and interview everyone in the family, and he has to do all this research, and there's some great, shocking twists and turns. And I saw someone say, that your first Agatha Christie book is often your favorite because that's the one that shocked you the most. I don't know. There are other books that really shocked me that she's written, books that really could have made the list, but this one, the twist was so horrifying and also really well executed that I really enjoyed it, and I didn't see it coming. Actually, my grandmother finished the book recently, and she saw it coming, and she was like, "Oh, I totally knew it was blue the whole time." She figured it out really early on. I did not. I was totally blown away by it, and I loved it. And some of her other books, of course, are really close to being up there, and I could have had multiple Agatha Christie's on here, but I feel that putting Crooked House as my number 10 is acceptable. My number 9 is actually probably the book I've talked about the least on the channel, and that is The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy. This is a kind of a military political thriller book. This is following the character of Jack Ryan. This is the first Jack Ryan book, and it is about this Russian sub that is making its way towards the U.S. And Jack Ryan figures out that that the commander of the sub intends to defect to the U.S., but the crew doesn't intend, or at least the privates and the corporals and the low level crew doesn't intend to. It's just the officers, and so they have to figure out a way to get them to defect properly. But the U.S. government is afraid that this ship is actually not going to defect and instead is going to blow stuff up and cause a war and stuff. And so it's all this kind of a race to find the Red October, to stop it, to figure out what's going on and all that stuff. And this, of course, launched Tom Clancy as a author. This is one of the, I think, first edition from the Naval Institute Press. It's a little torn up in a few areas here and here, a little scuffed up here, so it's not in pristine condition, but it's a first edition that I found in a bookstore for super cheap. And it's the first Tom Clancy I read. It's his first written, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved this book. And I intend to read more Tom Clancy books. I just haven't because I have other books to read, and also because his books are so huge and daunting, I've just been like, I'm not sure I should read those, but I will get to them all eventually, because I loved this book, and I thought it was just so brilliant of a book. So that is my number 9. My number 8 novel of all time is a science fiction novel by a man named Brad R. Torgerson. This is one of the more recent books that I read, and that is The Chaplain's War. This is a science fiction book about Earth has, expanded new colonies across the galaxy, and then this kind of insectoid race of aliens has basically been attacking us and capturing our people. And there's a chaplain's assistant who is basically forced to take over the Navy or the military chapel when the chaplain dies. And then this insectoid race basically recruits this guy to inform them about religion. This insectoid race doesn't understand religion, and so they need this guy to basically explain it to them. And in this process, he ends up being the person trying to broker peace and negotiate a truce between the humans and these insects because of his religious discussions. And this chaplain's assistant isn't that religious. And so it's just a very fascinating topic, and it has really great deep themes about religion, really great deep themes about a lot of stuff. And so that's why this is my number 8 single novel of all time. I read this book right after I did a science fiction books of all time ranking, and it didn't. And I was like, man, I should have waited to do that ranking because this would have been on it as one of the top books. So that is The Chaplain's War. The next book I'll talk about on my list is a fantasy, more of a humorous fantasy novel by one of my favorite authors, Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks is most known for his Shannara series, which I've read all of the Shannara novels. He's also written the Word and Void series and a few other series, but his lesser-known series that I think is also really good starts off with one of my favorite books, and that is Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold. I don't have a single copy of it, so I'm holding up the bind-up for the first 3 books that I have. This is my number 7 book of all time. I don't talk about the book that often because I've read all the series and don't intend to do a reread soon, but this novel, the first book in the series, is about this guy who is a lawyer in Chicago, and his wife's dead, and he feels like he has no purpose in life, everything stinks, and he was an alcoholic and all this stuff. And then he sees in a catalog the opportunity that he could buy his own mythical magical kingdom for only $1 million. And being a lawyer, he has that kind of money lying around, and he ends up purchasing it on a whim, just kind of being like, my life sucks, so I may as well do something. And so he goes and buys a magical kingdom, and he goes to the kingdom, and there's a reason it only cost $1 million, because the castle's in disrepair, the people are not listening to him, the wizard who is his big advisor is totally inept. One of his other advisors is literally a dog, a man who was turned into a dog, and there's all this just wacky stuff happening here. And not to mention, there's a dragon that's kind of been terrorizing the people of this magic kingdom of Landover. And it's very satirical. The subsequent books in the series read much more like a fantasy fairy tale that's straightforward and serious. They read much more fantasy fairy tale straightforward. This is obviously sort of satirical and is lighthearted and is kind of silly, and it was just so entertaining, had great themes about why fantasy is important, and it presents why escapism is also important. And so I just love Magic Kingdom for Sale Sold. And that's my number 7 novel of all time. Let's go to my number 6. My number 6 is another science fiction novel, and that is Ben Bova's Mars, another fairly recent read. Read this about a year ago. This is a science fiction novel about exploration of space, which I love, this kind of brand of hard science fiction. You have this crew that is from all across the world that is sent in the future to space or at least in this book's future, to space to go to Mars to try to explore Mars for the first time. So they're not building a colony in this book or anything. They just have a crew that's going to be there for a few weeks or months, and they're just going to explore Mars, get some testing done, do some science stuff, and then come back. And this book not only has some great action, some great plotting, a great romance in this book, but it also has a great look at what it would be like to fund, a mission to Mars. This is not a cheap thing like you might see in the movies. This would be really expensive to do, and also it would be very difficult because this mission requires people from all different countries in the world. This mission would be very difficult politically to get done, and then of course there are people who would have take issue with some of the science research that you're doing, and then to cap it all off, the main character makes some political mistakes at the beginning of the book that really harm everything. And then also there's some, he believes that there is basically life on Mars from the past, that they can determine that if there was really Martians there in the past. And so it's all about him trying to prove that theory right. And so there's so much into this book. And if you like things like the For All Mankind series, if you like the space exploration elements of The Martian, things like that, I think you'll enjoy this book. It is a very solid book that perfectly captures what I love about the hard sci-fi genre. Some hard sci-fi authors get a little bit too into the weeds of the science behind it. This book does not. This book feels very epic and feels very visual, and I also just love this cover. I just think this cover is just gorgeous. So that's my number 6 novel of all time. Now in my top 5 novels of all time, my number 5 is a legal thriller, and this is a John Grisham book. It's the only John Grisham book on the list, and that is Sycamore Row, the second book in his Jake Brigance series. Some of John Grisham's books are amazing and in my top novels of all time. I think A Time to Kill was easily in contention to be in the top novels of all time. The Litigators, in contention for top novels, as is the most recent one I read, The Runaway Jury. All those I think are top tier novels, potentially best novels of all time. But I am going with Sycamore Row, which is my favorite of the bunch, because this is the book that just hit me hardest in the feels. And this book, the basic premise, there's this old man who has a housekeeper, an African-American housekeeper, and he dies, and instead of leaving all his wealth to his children and grandchildren, he leaves all of his wealth to the housekeeper. And it is very controversial, and the children and grandchildren are doing everything they can to stop the housekeeper from getting the money. But our main character, who is the lawyer, Jake Brigance, does everything in his power to make sure the woman keeps that money. And it is just a terrific exploration of racism in the South. It is a terrific exploration of the legal system, of the way people treat each other, and it just has a gut-wrenching, heart-stopping ending that I just thought was fantastic. And this is my favorite of the John Grisham books, and it makes me think real hard, and is my number 5 novel of all time. Interestingly, my number 5 novel and my number 4 novel I actually read back to back, and so that was like an amazing reading experience. But that's my number 5. Getting my number 4 is a science fiction, the last science fiction book on the list. Well, there's one that you could kind of... Anyway, I'll explain. There's a science fiction novel, and it is by my favorite science fiction author, Timothy Zahn. And he's known for his Star Wars stuff, and and that's his best-selling by far. There's a huge gap. But he's written a ton of original science fiction novels. His Icarus series is his new series he's doing. He also has his Conquerors trilogy, his Cobra series, his Sybil's War. I mean, he has a ton of books that he's written, and most of them are amazing. But there's a single novel that just stands above the rest as just one of the most genius books I've ever read, and that was his book, Manta's Gift. This book is basically about a man who is a paralyzed from the neck down. He can talk, and that's about it. And he is contacted by the government that says, hey, we have this opportunity for you to serve the government and actually have purpose in life again. And he says, you know what? that would be great. I'd love to do that. And so, but what that purpose is, there is on the planet Jupiter, there are these flying manta rays who are sentient and are basically hampering the government's intention to get resources from Jupiter. And so the government is trying to negotiate with these manta rays, and they end up sending in this guy to negotiate with them, and they actually implant his essence into a manta ray. They take him out of his physical body, his corporeal body, and they put his essence into a manta ray. And that sounds totally bizarre and weird and wacky and crazy, but it works. And that's at the beginning of the book, so I'm not spoiling anything. And so he becomes a manta ray. And so his job is to negotiate and work with the manta rays on Jupiter, but he ends up kind of developing a connection with these manta rays and loving some of them, and he ends up deciding to side against the government and to side with the manta rays. And this pitch sounds very, very, very similar to Titanic, Avatar, to James Cameron's Avatar. And when I asked Tim Zahn about the connections between this and Avatar, he said, yeah, he thought that was funny. This book was written well before the Avatar movies came out. But there are plenty of similarities between them. But I absolutely love this. This is my favorite just original science fiction novel of all time. Let's go into my number 3. That was my number 4. My number 3 book of novel of all time is a fantasy novel by my favorite, not just my favorite fantasy author, but just my favorite author in general, and that is Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson has written a ton of novels recently. He keeps going. He's one of the top novelists out there. He's one of the only novelists who can say, I have 4 secret projects. You don't know what they are, but I want you to buy them. And people just went gung-ho. Millions of dollars were spent to buy those books. Anyway, he has written some amazing books. But my number 3 novel of all time is his novel Warbreaker, one of his standalones in the Cosmere, his Cosmere universe. This is set on a planet that has a magic system based off of colors, and it is breath is involved, and hair is involved, and all this stuff. And the basic premise is there is this princess who is basically forced to marry this god king in this other land. And he is mysterious and is, their people hate each other, but they only are doing this to try to save her people who they're afraid will be attacked by the god king. And so she's sent over to marry him, and everything is not as it seems when she meets him. There's also a plot line about her sister, who's also a princess, who basically is super angry that her sister is forced to go marry this guy, and so she goes and tries to rescue her sister and ends up starting basically a revolution in the God King's kingdom. And then there's a third plot line about these people who are basically people who have died but somehow resurrected, and so they're kind of gods, like demigods in their world. And this guy named Lightsong is one of the demigods, and he does not believe in his own divinity, and he ends up basically questioning all the religion stuff, and he ends up kind of getting involved in all the other 2 plot lines. And it's just all 3 of those things weave together, and it's a book that I've reread so many times. Every time I reread this, I love it even more. It's such an impressive novel. All 3 plot lines I think are terrific. I appreciate them more each time I read it, and it's so heartwarming to me. I love the romance. I love the action sequences. I love the world building. This is one of the rare times I actually like the magic system and care about the magic system. I really am not a magic system guy. This is one of the few exceptions. So that's why this is my number 3 novel of all time. Getting to my number 2 novel of all time is a media tie-in novel. There were no other media tie-in novels on the list. This is the only one on the list. And so that's why I didn't categorize this as science fiction, even though some people would categorize this as science fiction, but I'm categorizing it as media tie-in, and that is John Jackson Miller's Star Wars novel, Kenobi. This is my favorite Star Wars novel, my favorite media tie-in novel, my number 2 novel of all time. This is a book about Kenobi set immediately after the events of Revenge of the Sith, where he is stuck on Tatooine, and he is not able to leave the planet. He is trying to commune with Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon's not not answering the phone, more metaphorically speaking, and Obi-Wan's just trying to figure out, what do I do now that I'm alone and I have no purpose anymore? And so, but this book, interestingly, I said all that, it's not from really Kenobi's perspective. There's a few scenes here or there from his perspective, but like 90% of the book is told from the perspective of the townspeople on Tatooine. You meet this woman, Annaline Caldwell, who's a store owner who meets and is affected by Obi-Wan. You follow the perspective of Oren Galt, who is this kind of entrepreneur and businessman who views Kenobi as an opportunity. And then you meet Oren Galt's kids and Annaline Caldwell's kids, and you meet the other townspeople who are just wondering, who is this mysterious guy, and why does he keep miraculously saving people in these random situations? He's a very nice guy, but he won't talk to anyone really. It's really impressive. And so it's an atmospheric novel about what Tatooine life is like, from the perspective of the newcomer coming to town, and it's very much a Western. If you like Western novels, and you're like, I like Star Wars too, this is probably the book for you, because it's very much Western inspired in so many of the themes. And so that's why this is my number 2 novel of all time. My number 1 novel of all time, I'm surprised if people who are longtime viewers of the channel don't know this, because I talk about it so much. And my number 1 novel of all time is another Brandon Sanderson novel, and that is Elantris. This is an amazing standalone. Nobody else likes it as much as me. Everyone I know who has read Brandon Sanderson puts this either at the bottom or in like their bottom 3 Sanderson novels. But for me, this is not only my favorite Sanderson book, it's my favorite novel of all time. The way this book deals with political themes, the way it deals with religious themes, the way it deals with social themes, the way it deals with action and world building, and the magic system's very impressive. The character work is impressive. There's 3 main character plot lines that you follow. You have Raoden, who is the prince of this one kingdom, and he is basically struck with this thing called the Sheod, which is basically leprosy, and he is forced out of his home kingdom, and he is forced to go live in the land of Elantris, which is the land of the lepers, basically, of the people who were struck by the Sheod, and he has like no life left anymore. Well, Serene was like just about to marry him. She was like a day or 2 away from marrying him, and now she's stuck. She'd already signed legal documents saying she would marry him, so she's kind of stuck in this marriage that is never consummated. And so now she has to basically live, and she thinks he's dead, because everyone tells her he's dead. So she has to live in this land that is foreign to her, where they worship different religions, and she is in a very different social setting than when she was a princess back home. And so she has to navigate the political intricacies, and she ends up trying to do what's right and help people of this new land out. Then you also have the villain, Hrathen, who is a fantastic villain. Hrathen is this religious leader who is sent to the same land that Serene's in, and his goal is to convert the people of this land before his religion and his country take over that land. His mandate is, you will convert them by this time or we will wipe them all out and we will take over. And so Hrathen kind of is at odds with Serene, because he's trying to cause this religious change, and Serene is just not having it, and she's trying to fight against him politically and religiously and socially. And it's just all those themes work so well. There is only one thing about this book I would change, and actually I'd say the same thing for Kenobi. There's only one tiny detail at the very end of the book of Kenobi I would change, is literally like one line that I would add at the end of that book. And for Elantris, there's only one page that I'm like, I would change this and do it this way instead. But other than that, it is like a flawless book. And people who don't love it as much don't make sense to me, because I love this book so much. It's just, it connects with me so well. So those are my top 10 novels of all time. I had some political thrillers in there. I had a legal thriller. I had murder mystery. I had science fiction that's more in the hard sci-fi. I had science fiction that's more in the fantastical. I had whimsical fantasy. I had more serious fantasy. I had media tie-in fiction. I had a lot in my top 10. But that is my top 10 novels of all time. If you've read any of these, let me know your thoughts on them. What would be in your top 10 novels of all time? And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.